Welcome to Ideagen TV. So excited to have with us today Simon Bland, the CEO of GLIDE, the Global Institute for Disease Elimination. Simon, welcome.
Hi, George. Good to see you.
So wonderful to have you on this Ideagen TV program today, live from the UK. Hope you're doing fantastic. Looks like a great background. So hoping there's a respite from everything that's happening globally at the moment. Simon, and your leadership is incredibly appreciated at GLIDE for all of the work you're doing to eliminate disease.
Well, thanks, George, and welcome to quarantine in the UK. I just flew in from the US, so I'm halfway through my 14 days of quarantine here.
Well, your dedication to telling the story and leading is profound, and digging right into the interview. Simon, as we take stock of progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the world is grappling with this new pandemic. What is your perspective on the global situation? And most importantly, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel?
So I think about this, George, in terms of the SDGs, and just cast my mind back to that transition from the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, to the SDGs, and what was different. And two things seem to be really different for me. The first was, and we'll get back onto this, is this interconnectedness of these 17 goals. But the other was that the MDGs was very much a framework for North-South development assistance, coordinating this development assistance really for poorer countries. The SDGs is universal and all-encompassing, and the SDGs are as relevant for a high-income country as for a low-income country. And you know, I think COVID has made it crystal clear that the world and humanity are highly interdependent, highly interconnected, and intertwined with one another. You know, I often made the case that global health demonstrated that we are one humanity and one species, and really sort of correlated and co-reliant on one another. And COVID has shown that. And COVID has shown that, what's the phrase, you know, someone sneezes at one side of the world and someone catches a cold elsewhere. So we're living that reality right now in the starkest possible terms. You know, and so in this sort of interconnectedness of the planet, humanity, you know, I think we call the SDGs you know, a plan for people, planet, and prosperity, to bring it all together. And the fact that you have this set of interconnected sectors or disciplines, I think really illustrates the complexity of the system that we are and the system in which we live. So I think it's this week the high-level political forum meets in New York. The ministerial segment is later this week. 47 countries come and do their voluntary national reviews and talk about progress towards achieving these sustainable development goals. And let's be honest and not kid ourselves, I don't think a single country on the planet is meeting all the goals. And so it's really important to take stock of where there is progress and where there's less progress. But equally, we have to realize that COVID is a massive disruptor of that progress. The extent to which it disrupts, delays, postpones, and sets back the ambitions is yet to be worked out. We still haven't figured out the full consequences, economic costs, social costs, and health costs, and cost in lives of this pandemic. But it's inevitably going to make things much more difficult. It doesn't mean we rip up the SDGs or throw them away. For me, it means we have to redouble our efforts and see what we learn from this and how that learning can help us accelerate and move forward. You know, we often hear this expression from humanitarian crises, the desire to build back better. My hope is that following COVID, as we come out and transition out of the pandemic, that we are building back better for the future. So it's a huge challenge. Now, is there light at the end of the tunnel? I think the short answer is yes. The question is, how long is that tunnel and how windy is that tunnel? I suspect it's quite a long tunnel with many twists and turns still to come. So I think this notion of, everything will be fine by the autumn, or we'll suddenly get a vaccine and off we go, life resumes as it did before. I don't think that's a serious scenario. I think we have a scenario where we're dealing with the consequences of this and transitioning for some considerable time to come. And I can't put my finger on what that would be, but certainly, a couple of years, maybe longer. So, my hope is that there's an incremental transition, but expecting suddenly a switch to be flipped and everything's back to normal is not how I see this panning out.
Yeah, and that echoes a lot of the expert sort of analysis. No one really knows exactly when and how. We do have sort of a roadmap for the vaccine process, it appears, and we're all extremely hopeful that this technology and the science is accelerating to a point where we can get maybe not ahead of these types of situations, but maybe to mitigate in some way the impact, the overall impact. And so, as someone who has spent so much of your professional life working in developing countries, you mentioned, of course, the MDGs, which were focused on these developing countries. Then 6 years with the United Nations working on HIV/AIDS, and now, incredibly so, as the CEO of a global health startup. I mean, based out of Abu Dhabi, as we all know, you're working with folks like Bill Gates and Crown Prince. And what lessons are relevant for this COVID response based on what you're seeing in your role as CEO of Glide?
So it's I don't want to be frivolous, but it's an incredible inconvenience to have a world shut down when one's trying to start up an organization to help improve global health as part of a big sort of global family. But so many people have been hurt in so many different ways by this pandemic. It's really important that we, I think, learn lessons from the past and learn lessons now for the future. So I, in my head, use a framework of sort of what if, what now, and what next. And the what if part of that, which really is over the last few decades, there have been many global public health experts who have said it's not actually a question of if, but a question of when we have a pandemic that has this sort of dual dial, high contagious features with a fairly high mortality rate, and that's what we're seeing with SARS coronavirus 2 and COVID. And so we saw it coming. We raised the alarm many times. Here it is, and we're trying to deal with it. So we went through that what if to now, and we're sort of what now, and we're learning constantly what now. So how really quite different from how we did it several months ago. Sort of better knowledge of some new therapies, dexamethasone, remdesivir. We know that we were intubating too early in the past. We understand that we weren't monitoring oxygen saturation levels in the blood as early as we could, as an early sign of the disease becoming more severe. We've learned a lot more about non-pharmaceutical interventions, social distancing, stay at home, work from home if you're lucky enough to do that, face masks, etc., washing your hands, etc. So we've learned as we go on, and we are in a better place, and we'll continue to learn and continue to have new tools in our arsenal. So that's the learning sort of what now, each step of the way. There are real challenges with that. We've seen real challenges. We've seen very different approaches in different countries. There's lots of lessons to be learned from different countries. Of course, not all lessons are applicable everywhere, but understanding and growing our understanding is crucially important. And then a big question for me is, well, what's next? If we get to the end of that tunnel, where either we have, a really effective vaccine, effective treatments, better diagnostics, and we've really driven this down either to being eliminated or eradicated, or down to a low level of control, as we have with HIV and AIDS. But what have we learned for the future to be better prepared for the future? And unfortunately, humanity seems to be driven by, sort of this panic and lethargy. So, we have a crisis, we deal with the crisis. It's amazing that we've got over 100 candidate vaccines in development right now. The TB community is saying, what does it take for us to get candidates for tuberculosis? So, I'm hopeful we will get new tools for COVID, but I'm equally hopeful that we learn lessons for the future where we are better prepared. We have an easier response, a more coordinated response, because the next one could be worse. And this is a very different world today than it was 6 months ago. I think the human spirit and human ingenuity is amazing, but it's equally possible that we move on and forget. We come out of this and say, well, we've done that now. We've had that pandemic. We won't worry about this in the future. And that would be absolutely the wrong response going forward. So that's my hope, is that we learn those lessons. I guess there's a couple of others I would just say, George. Leadership is really important. HIV told us that when you had leaders that stood up, recognized the disease, recognized the challenge, committed to doing something about it, we saw progress. When there was denialism, it flourished. So I think leadership is really important in this, and tackling stigma and discrimination. Stigmatizing people for, I worry that we get to a place where we have different classes of global citizens, those who carry the antibodies and those that don't carry the antibodies. And so I think tackling those issues around stigma and discrimination are really important, and big lessons from the HIV/AIDS world in that regard.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, just from a basic sense of what we're seeing, is that there's the amount of information that we're getting, some contradictory, some seems to be on point, makes it much more difficult, especially perhaps trying to tackle the spread. So that seems to me one of the biggest challenges, is that there's not just one source of trusted information. There's so many sources. If you just Google coronavirus, gosh, you get pages and pages of symptoms or treatments, or so that, how do you deal with that challenge, just to go off your point about how difficult this is?
So look, this is the first pandemic in a social media age, where a large majority of people get their information from something like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, or and trusting the information you get. There just needs to be a personal responsibility to do some research and think about it. I guess the one thing I would say is that what I know about COVID today from what I knew about it several months ago is markedly different. So if you had asked most Western global public health experts 4 months ago about face masks, I think most would have said marginal benefit, don't do it. You're likely to disrupt supply chains and prevent critical frontline workers from getting the masks that they need. Don't do it. The advice has changed. And I think it's fine to change advice as we know more. I do think that's an important point. If I don't think anyone in the global health field thinks they know everything and are not learning, particularly with a new virus. It's new. I mean, it's brand new. We're understanding more and more what it does to coagulation and blood. We understand more and more its impact on various organs. We're increasingly learning what some of the longer term effects of this might be. That's fine. We're learning as we go along, and I think we have to be more tolerant of saying the data are coming out and telling us something else, and our best advice now is this, and that may be advice that was different several months ago. I
Sure.
think that's okay, and we have to do that. But it is very difficult because I think we've all seen a little bit of some of this has turned political. There's politicization there. One can understand some of that, but equally, I think we need to find ways. Individuals need to take responsibility to try and find information from a variety of sources. And look, I know where I get my information, and who I trust. And it's multiple sources to correlate, because there will be some contradictions, and then you work through contradictions. There's a big conversation going on in this country now about whether or not face masks should be mandatory, or not. The Prime Minister thinks one thing, other ministers maybe think another thing, public scientists are thinking another thing. They'll come up with a policy. I do think, public health is one part of this, but not the only part of this. There are considerations beyond public health that need to be considered. And so, and I've heard Dr. Fauci and others talk about this. We will provide the best medical advice that we possibly can. There are some things that are outside of our gambit. Everybody wants kids to go back to school. Everybody wants people to go back to work. It's, what is the science telling us about how we do that safely? So it is a really big issue, George, and it won't go away. And if we are lucky enough to have a vaccine, this will be a hot issue then as well, because who gets it, who doesn't get it, who wants it, who doesn't want it, and why will be a big part of that conversation going forward.
Oh gosh, something to look forward to. It's nothing's easy, and we know that nothing's easy. Yeah. But you're right. It is. In the United States this year, obviously an election year, and there's consequences for every action. You shut something down, something else isn't happening. What are those consequences? And you have to weigh it all. And I like what you said. I mean, you weigh the science. The science drives, hopefully, the decision making, and you can make an informed decision based on what we now know, which is so markedly different than what we maybe knew in the last time we spoke, which was in February when you were a guest on Ideagen TV. We were talking about an emerging pandemic. We were talking about all these different things. So since the last we spoke in February, how has your focus, the glide, changed? What are you working on? And has the urgency accelerated based on the current situation?
So I think many organizations, certainly in global health, are saying, so, what does this mean for us? And I think, it's easy for many organizations to do a pivot to say, well, we've got to work on COVID-19. It's a defining health crisis of our age, of the century, perhaps, certainly of our generation, and that's laudable and important. We've had this conversation. We're basically saying we are not taking on COVID, but we need to take account of COVID. So our focus has not changed. We still care about disease elimination and eradication. We still focus on a number of neglected tropical diseases, on malaria and on polio. If anything, these diseases will be more neglected, not less neglected, because of COVID. The urgency is as urgent as it ever was, but we're realistic and accept and expect some postponement and delays. We're working on ways of looking at that I can talk about later. But no, our focus has not changed. It remains urgent. Taking account of COVID means figuring out new ways of working, figuring out the impact of COVID on what we care about, but also how can we help with from what we know in terms of strengthening COVID responses across the world. And so that's sort of what we're grappling with right now, George.
Incredible. And as you think about the whole issue of disease elimination and eradication, how are you addressing it or thinking about it via the context of COVID?
So if we're not taking on COVID, but we must take account of it. So what are the challenges that face us? Well, the first so of course you've got the direct impact of this disease, which is killing people, right? It's killed what over 500,000, 560,000 people already. There's 3.3 million people, I think, infected from Johns Hopkins today, and it's that is still increasing. Hearing Dr. Tedros and Mike Ryan speak from WHO, we're in the thick of it. We're not at the end of it, and the worst may yet be to come in terms of the numbers. We have not yet understood how this is going to play out across Africa. We're seeing how it's spreading rapidly across South America. We're seeing big numbers in India. So we're still in the thick of this. So you have that direct challenge, but you equally have backsliding elsewhere. So modeling by WHO and others on malaria, for example, shows a worst case scenario of mortality increasing from 400,000 a year to well over 700,000 a year, not far off a doubling. That sets you back 20 years. That's the sort of numbers we were dealing with 20 years ago. And so, it's an illustration of progress towards the SDGs could be set back decades by this, if we're not careful. So we're looking at, well, what does backsliding look like, and what can we do to try and help prevent backsliding? Malaria is an interesting one because, when you talk about contradictory or conflicting information and advice, how do you deal with this when you say, you get malaria, you think you've got malaria, go to the clinic. You've got COVID, you think you've got COVID, don't go to the clinic. But the symptoms are the same, by and large. So it becomes very difficult for messaging to the public in terms of what to do. So we have to look at that backsliding. We have to look at operational models. How are we all going to work in new and different ways, where we're not able to travel freely, where we're not able to convene the world's experts, where we're not able to be on the front line with communities, learning from them and helping them sort of progress. So there are big challenges for how we work. We're looking at it around those challenges and saying, well, what are the advocacy opportunities for us? What are the stories that we can tell, the messages that we can give, the lessons that we can learn and share? We're looking at it around, well, what are some of the synergies with work that we already support around disease elimination? So community health, mass drug administration and drug distribution, data surveillance, contact tracing. I mean, a whole set of public health things that we and many other organizations know and support are very relevant and synergistic to a COVID response. And then finally, we're thinking about innovations. What are the innovations that we can learn from this that allow us to sort of move forward and prevent that backsliding, but also perhaps move forward the agenda of COVID as well. So that's the sort of framework, George, that we're looking at, staying true to our mandate, trying to learn lessons, but finding ways in which we can sort of support COVID response, but also learn from that response and integrate with that response.
Well, Simon, as you have taken on this new role as CEO of Glide, with a just an outsized mission statement, the issue of leadership comes into clear focus. And we know, because we've seen your leadership and your leadership style, which is extremely effective in helping to galvanize, first of all, understanding the importance of collaboration and so many other elements of leadership that are vital. Being able to simply listen, right? As you've mentioned during this interview today, you've been collecting data, you've been listening, you're looking at, 3 or 4 or 5 or more trusted sources of information to then sort of, collectively look at what the answers are. Not, you're doing it in a diligent, methodical, and very deliberate way for everything that you're doing, as exemplified by, again, your work throughout your career, especially during your work at UNAIDS, and now obviously at Glide. And gosh, what a time to be taking over as CEO of a health startup. I mean, you're right. But you know what? At the same time, there's no better leader than you, Simon, and this comes from us having senior leadership abilities to take on these incredible challenges. And so as we look at the balance between national and global approaches to fighting a pandemic like SARS-CoV-2, Why do you think that effective leadership is so crucial now more than ever?
So I guess if I go back to that what if, what now, what next scenario, I see two big what next scenarios that could play out. One is very much free for all, sort of me first approach. Another is actually we are going to be better off if we find ways of tackling these problems together. For me, leadership very much starts at the front line. So I have always been inspired by those health workers, doctors, nurses, community leaders, people just working at that front line that really make a difference. And I've said this in the HIV response. I say it in malaria. It'll be the same with with COVID. Without community by community sort of responses and good strong leadership by individuals, there we don't get where we need to be. So that's hugely important to me. Strong political leadership and messaging, we talked about that already. It's crucially important, and ever will be the case. Balancing out that there is an imperative, an absolutely legitimate imperative for political leaders to think about their citizenry and protecting it. It's absolutely fundamental. And I have absolute respect for that. All politicians must do that first and foremost. I think the case we want to make and need to make as public health professionals is the best way to do that and to provide that protection to citizens is take a global perspective, because the sneeze in one part of the world leading to a cold in another part of the world is illustrated barely ahead of us right now. And so tackling this everywhere, has benefits everywhere. Trying to tackle it one country at a time, I think, won't get the end result. So if we care about our citizens, we have to think globally. This is a global public bad. COVID, coronavirus disease 2019 is bad for everybody. I don't know. I was trying to imagine, are there people on this planet that are totally unaffected by COVID? Very few, very few. Almost every person on this planet will be affected by COVID. That's astonishing, right? And so that's a global bad on a scale we haven't seen, and that needs a global public good. And global public goods come through collaboration. So I've come out of the UN. I believe in that collaboration. It's not without its challenges. It's not without its problems. It's not without its faults. It's great to see Dr. Tedros commissioning an independent commission to look at WHO's response. The Lancet's there will be hundreds and hundreds of commissions of inquiry, looking at COVID. My message is that spare 1%, spare 2% of the resources that you're committing nationally to international efforts for global public good. I think that leadership is really important. And if we do that, I think we have a sense that we can be better prepared to respond in the future. If we don't, I worry we'll repeat all the same mistakes again.
Yeah, and you're right. We must learn from the past in order to avoid mistakes in the future. And as we look at the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, committed to leaving no one behind. That's the stated commitment of these goals. How can the world go about guaranteeing that people are not actually left further behind because of COVID?
So it's people are already left behind, and we see that. And I think there was some thinking early on that COVID could be the great equalizer. Everybody's susceptible. Everybody, is at risk of infection. It doesn't discriminate, but it clearly does discriminate. There's lots of discrimination here in terms of who are essential workers, who are frontline workers, who has the ability to stay at home, who has the ability to work from home, who has the ability to socially distance, who has the ability, not to go to work the next day because they've got a buffer, of their livelihood. It just makes the poor poorer and the marginalized more marginalized. So that's sort of almost an inevitability that we see. So what does that mean going forward? Well, let's just use 3 quick examples. Well, let's use one example. Let's use vaccines. Everybody hopes that we get a vaccine or several vaccines that are sufficiently efficacious and safe that they can be used to provide immunity for the global population from this disease. A great outcome. We never got it with HIV. We found a different way we're dealing with HIV. Coronavirus is simpler than the HIV virus. And we have a number of candidates out there, and we have some great innovations on at-risk investments to get manufacturing capacity up and ready, even before we know if a vaccine is going to be successful. So we're doing things that we never thought of before, which are amazing. And the Gates Foundation and CEPI and other organizations playing a huge role in that. But let's say we're successful, with 1 or 2 of these candidates. Who gets that vaccine? We will only stamp out COVID-19 if we get rid of coronavirus everywhere, not just in those countries that can afford a vaccine. So we need to find ways in which everybody gets access. And so the Gates Foundation and CEPI and others are working on some facilities, financial facilities, an advanced market commitment, a COVAX facility, to try and get global investment in a way that sort of balances this domestic desire to protect one's citizens, but also recognizes that to do that, you also need to provide the vaccines elsewhere. So we're working on, I'm looking at it, but we're not working on it. It's being worked on. What are the mechanisms for doing that, so that frontline workers, vulnerable populations are among some of the first to get the vaccine? Because if you start to flatten that curve and reduce that curve everywhere, you stand a much better chance of doing it anywhere else, rather than taking a country by country approach to this. So that's my biggest fear, is that we saw it with some of the we saw it with hydroxychloroquine, for example. It got hyped up, people thought it might be interesting, it got bought up. Those that needed hydroxychloroquine, either for malaria treatment or for lupus or rheumatoid arthritis, we're seeing stockouts and price spikes. One could see the same with remdesivir. One could see the same with dexamethasone, although I think it's pretty easy to ramp up production there. So we do need to think carefully about how, if we do get great new tools, particularly a vaccine, how do we ensure that the distribution is done in a way that maximize the chances of success of suppressing this virus everywhere, and getting to the point where we get back to some semblance of normality. And I don't believe that happens by just those countries that can afford it getting it and looking after themselves, and the rest of the world being left to their own devices, because clearly they won't have access if that's the model that we adopt.
That's right. And Simon, so as we look at these sustainable development goals and we think about specifically goal number 17, global partnerships, goal number 17 is obviously crucial to the success of achieving the goals by 2030. What role will Glide and your leadership play in this?
So I think we just need to be, an advocate, George, for. I hesitate to say the word globalization, but advocates for collective action and global solidarity. I think it's, and I worry that we're probably, any audience listening to this will be, sort of part of the choir and already convinced. I think we've got to find ways of letting others hear this message and understand this message and believe this message, and in doing so, we need to recognize the shortcomings and the challenges of sort of global partnerships and institutions and all those difficulties. Antonio Guterres at the UN has been passionately pushing a reform agenda to make the UN more fit for purpose going forward. And I think that's laudable and important. Tedros, I think, with his independent commission, will be looking to say, what do we learn? What can we do better? So I think we can advocate in that way. Glide it's a startup. It's small. It's nascent. The only way we'll deliver, and the only way we'll learn, and the only way we'll make a difference is in partnering with others. So we find where are some of the gaps, where do we think we can add some value, where can we do some value, shared value creation, with others. We talked before about this, George. We're not a top-down organization that thinks we can ride into a country and tell them how to do things and have all the solutions. But maybe by learning from one country and engaging with another country, we can, improve exchange of ideas and lessons. And, there's lots of good examples for that. So, partnership, I think it's a word that's often overused, but it has to be at the heart of what we do going forward, just because of the very nature of who we are and where we're coming from.
Yeah, and that's right. And I think that, Simon, as you look at those organizations that are most resilient, the organizations that are most resilient are typically those that are focused on creating partnerships in times that are not, related to a pandemic or an urgency or emergency. They're creating these partnerships in those times that are, let's call them normal in a sense. And now, as they enter into a phase where, whether it's a company, an NGO, the public sector, the deeper the connection, the stronger those partnerships, the more resilient you've seen these specific entities come into and hopefully come out of this pandemic. Because if you have to learn from zero what an organization or another type of cross-sector partner does, you don't know their capacity, you don't know the leadership. Now everyone's communicating with technology. If you know the person, like we've met you, we know you, it's much easier to have a conversation that's accelerated. And so, I think that's one other lesson that I've seen come out of this is when one day, and you see the light at the end of the tunnel, we get out of the tunnel and the light is shining again. I think cross-sector partnerships, goal number 17, partnerships for goals, must be and should be a focus for every organization across sectors. And so we pivot now to advice. You've had an incredible career. You're now leading up and working with, again, folks like Bill Gates and the Crown Prince, but most importantly, you're working on helping to eliminate some of the world's most devastating diseases. And so we focus on what is important, which is the youth of the world, because they're the future. What is the single most important piece of advice that you would provide to the youth of our planet?
It's a really tough one, George. I think the advice that I give is to people like you and me and the others that have been around a long time, which is listen, create space and find ways to listen. So, there's some great examples at the UN. I'm sure you've been part of them. The Youth Summit. When I used to go and speak at the Youth Summit, I was blown away by the energy, the ambition, the creativity, just the inquiring minds. I remember we did one late session, finished around 6 p.m., I think, in the UN. We had about 300 or 400 people in the audience. We finished the panel conversation, and the moderator said, "Any questions?" And I tell you, 2/3 of the crowd stuck their hands up to ask questions. It was just phenomenal. So I think the advice for us is create space. I was very pleased that during my time in New York, when these youth summits happened, we helped facilitate youth delegations going to their collective missions. They were coming in from different countries. They'd go and see their representative. And over the course of 2 very short years, all ambassadors were making themselves available to talk to youth delegations. So I think people are getting it now. I think my advice for young people is sort of don't take no for an answer, and be a little bit I don't know if bolshy is an American word or just British, but the AIDS movement changed the world, because they were, quite frankly, dissatisfied and they wanted change. And so I think, you've got to, yes, you can be respectful, but sometimes you've also got to push quite hard. I was very pleased with one initiative in the UN. Someone that worked with me, a young person in the UN, took it upon herself to create an affiliation or a group called the Young UN. Just young people in the UN who want to see change and want to make a difference in this world. And in the spate of a very short period of time, they were getting audiences with the Secretary General and speaking and things. So, there is space in this world, and we need to hear, and we need to create space for young people. I'm pretty sure I'm the oldest person in my organization now. It's telling me something. The organization's getting younger. But they, so many of them know an awful lot more than I do. So we just need to give them, some space. And together, I think we can find, George, is what you do at Ideagen. You bring people from different sectors, different stakeholders, different walks of life, different perspectives together. And different things happen when you do that. And I think when it's intergenerational as well, it's another dimension. So let's just create space and opportunities to do that.
Simon Bland, CEO, GLIDE, the Global Institute for Disease Elimination. What is your post-summit ask for our global audience? Millions of folks will watch this program. What from across the world and literally every country, what would you, ask them as we collectively continue to change the world?
So I think I've said this before, George. I don't know if you've heard me, but to the SDGs, I say, so help make them famous, make them personal, and find a way of getting invested. Now, it may be that anybody that watches this is already there, but I do think there's an awful lot of people in this world that have no idea what the SDGs are. And we need to find a way of advocating for those, but in a way that is real for people, and meaningful. Don't get me wrong, the SDGs are so much more well known and understood than the MDGs, but it's still nowhere near where it needs to be. Just understanding them on a personal level, why do they matter for everybody? And they do. Everything from sort of institutions and governance down to education and health and livelihood, climate, economies. We know it matters to all of us, and then find ways of getting invested, and that can be either through understanding capital markets and trying to nudge capital markets in the direction of being more sustainable, with better governance and better understanding of the environmental consequences of what they do. It can be invested in terms of just making sure you tell stories to your family and friends and get them, sort of to understand this more. But just find ways of getting yourself into a place that can help, make this change. Because frankly, if we deliver the SDGs by 2030 or 2035 or 2040, or we deliver 75% of them, we're in a better world than we were before. And that has to be, and that's good for everybody. And I think it can be good for everybody. So that's hope. Get out of our echo chamber and you get the rest of the world on board.
Simon Bland, clearly for our global audience, leadership defined. What is a way folks can learn more about what the work you're doing at GLIDE?
We're very young. We do have a web presence now, glide.ae. People can find our initial website there to find more information. There's contact information there to get in touch with us. We've got a growing partnership across the global health world. We look forward to being able to get on a plane. My biggest regret right now is that I can't be where I want to be on the front line and in Africa, working with old colleagues and learning from them. But we'll get there. But glide.ae will find us, and there's contact information there.
Simon Bland, CEO, GLIDE, incredible insights, perspectives, and perhaps most importantly, for your global leadership. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Great pleasure.